thank you for the book. Thank you for the years of work into all of this and on the other presidents.
Sure. Thank you, Doug.
The book is Inside the Clinton White House, An Oral History.
I just wondered, did you specifically have a chance to interview any of the Secret Service officers that served in the administration? And was there a consensus amongst them about life there that you might want to say something about?
Everybody heard the question. Okay, am I still, okay.
Yeah.
You can hear me fine. All right, the question was about interviewing Secret Service officers, and the answer was no, we did not. Our typical mission is to interview people who are not members of the permanent staff at the White House. I know that there are books out now, both written by people who were in the detail and people who have interviewed a lot of folks in the Secret Service detail. At one point, a couple of the personal aides, who are the people who follow the president around, sort of wake him up in the morning and make sure that he's got all his paperwork, suggested it might be a good idea for us to talk with the head of the Secret Service detail, but we didn't do it. But there were discussions in some of the interviews, and I can't recall whether any of this makes it in the book. One of the things that I should say, by the way, is that if these are things that you're interested in, the book itself is supposed to provide a gateway into the interview archive. So if you see anything in here that's interesting, please know that you can go straight to the Miller Center website and can link onto that individual interview, and you can read it in its entirety if you want to. This is a compilation of extracts from, 5,000 or 6,000 pages of interviews, and so it's kind of a greatest hits version of that archive, on the assumption that most people won't take the time to go back to the originals. But our core mission is not to write books like this. Our core mission is to create this interview archive so that anybody now or in the future who wants to understand an administration can go and look at it. So I think we could have learned some useful things from talking with the members of the Secret Service detail, and talking with the staff members that we did interview. Let me just say that there was a good deal of skepticism about the kind of reports that were leaking out of the White House. There were stories about Mrs. Clinton throwing lamps and fights in the residence and so forth, and those things were not borne out in any of the interviews. Now, were they shooting straight with us? I don't know. I think they probably were. One of the things that I meant to mention earlier is that there's a quote that I took from George Orwell, which is that an autobiography is only to be trusted if the writer reveals something disgraceful. And that means that effectively, in providing your own account, unless you're willing to deal with the negatives, you shouldn't trust it, because everybody's life, viewed honestly, is full of negatives. I mean, if you think about your own stories, all of the losses and things, that tends to come front and center. And I'm very pleased that in these interviews we deal with those disgraceful things, and we deal with the things that are uncomfortable for people. It's remarkable the extent to which in all of our interviews across all of our projects, these are used as venues for people to talk about their own shortcomings in serving the president. With that as a predicate, if people are willing to talk about their own shortcomings and the shortcomings of the president, I'm willing to believe them when they tell us that there are certain things that are out in the public domain that simply are not true. And this is one of those areas, that there was not the kind of mischief in the residence that sometimes is reported. But I can't say that with absolute certainty.
Mr. Riley, thanks a lot. A two-part question. The first is, recently we've seen a resurrection of the report of the travel office scandal and her role in it or lack of it.
Okay. There
are two sides to that story. I wonder if you got into that in your incident reviews. And the second is staff loyalty, a very interesting point you made. Cheryl Mills has been instrumental in her life and in the president's life for a long, long time.
Yeah.
I wonder if you had the opportunity to interview Cheryl Mills.
Okay, two good questions. The first, refresh my memory. The travel office. We did talk about it a little bit. I remember Mac McClarty saying on the travel office, he says it's a little bit like you're walking down the fairway of a golf course and you get hit by a ball from a tee on another fairway. That they were focused on things like the economic plan and the residue of whitewater. And this sort of hit them from out of nowhere. And McClarty's response to this was, we handled it terribly, that we were new in the administration, that Harry Thomason, who was one of the Clintons' friends from Arkansas, who had been in the film industry, television industry, had been involved in it because Harry Thomason wanted a cut of the action of the travel office, and he had brought to McClarty's attention and the attention of other people in the White House that there were some questionable activities going on inside the travel office. And McClarty said the optics of what we did were terrible, particularly since Thomason himself, it gave every appearance of his self-dealing. But he said, the fact is, I ran a car dealership in Arkansas for years and years. He said, if I'd caught one of my people with $8,000 of company money in their private account, I would have fired him immediately. He said, we did an accounting firm audit. The audit came back. The accountant said, clearly this is unacceptable behavior, and we took action accordingly. So I don't know what the latest is on this, but the sense, at least from McClarty, and there may be others who dealt with this, was that at the core that there were some managerial issues that needed to be dealt with, and they dealt with them. They just didn't handle it very well. So I'll echo again what Doug said. I think most of the people, particularly the two White House counsels, who are the lawyers who are there to observe and be accountable for the legal behavior within the White House. Both of them said things like whitewater. Abner Mikva in particular said, if I ever write a book, I'm going to entitle it The Nothing That Was Whitewater. He said it was nothing, there literally was nothing there. There were reports over and over and over again. People dug into these things. It was a little bit like, like Vince Foster's suicide, which had two separate independent counsel studies done, both of which came to the same conclusion, and yet there are still people out there peddling the story that Vince Foster killed himself because he was having an affair with Hillary Clinton. Now, Nussbaum also says, I think that didn't happen. He said, I actually vetted. I had a conversation with Foster, and I think he was shooting straight with me. This is sort of under double veils of candor, where the first conversation was taking place, one counsel to another, vetting each other before they come into the White House, which he said, Vince, tell me, what can people say about you that would create problems for you? I need to know this to protect the president. He said, well, people could say I had a relationship with Mrs. Clinton. Nussbaum said, they could say that about you? I've never heard that. Is it true? No, it's not true. And Foster said, Nussbaum said, I later had a conversation with Mrs. Foster where she also believes there was absolutely nothing to it. So could they be wrong? They could be wrong. As Nussbaum said, there are only two people who really know the answer to the question. But under those circumstances, I think it's a remarkably candid window onto this. So I'm filibustering your question about the travel office. Now about Cheryl Mills. I think that there is an interview with Cheryl Mills in the archive, but this gives me an opportunity to clarify one point. Doug cites 134 interviews done for the Clinton Project, and that is true. We conducted 134 interviews as part of the Clinton Project. This book is made up of excerpts from about 65 of those interviews, which are the 65 that are currently opened and available for public examination. About half of the Clinton archive is still sealed, as is our standard operating procedure. The laws governing oral history are very different from the laws governing journalism. We are required to get the express written consent of anybody we interview before we're allowed to make their words public. This is true across every project that we do, and there are, as I suggested, about half of our Clinton interviews that are still unopened. Don't read too much into that. If you look back if you go out the hall and you see this portrait at the end of the hallway, which is an event we did with Gerald Ford administration alumni, wonderful pictures of an impossibly young Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, who convened here in April of 1977 for the very first oral history interview we did. there are still some people from that interview that we have not gotten clearances to open their words, and they're still under seal. There are still interviews that we did when I was a graduate student here in the early 1980s from Carter administration people who have not agreed to open their interviews yet. So although it would be a temptation to say the Clintons are covering this up because these interviews are not yet released, it's just a matter of course that, that there will be some that will not open. And in fact, I think probably the percentage for the George H.W. Bush project, Bush, the father, I suspect that we're probably at about the 60% level or so of opening those interviews. But I think I'm correct in saying that Cheryl Mills was interviewed. That was one that I didn't do.
So you kind of answered it, because at the very beginning, you said these were off the cuff, is what you told the people as you were interviewing them. And so then after hours of conversation, and it's all on tape or whatever it's called nowadays, you would have to get their permission?
That's correct. And it is standard oral history procedure, and I can show you the textbooks on these things, which define how the process is to be done, where we will, under a veil of strict confidentiality, record these conversations, and then we create a transcript. The transcript becomes the authoritative record of the interview. That thing is edited. The speaker has the opportunity to review that transcript to make sure that it comports with what they wish the record to contain. Then we're in a position where we go back to them to ask them if it's okay for us to release that transcript to the public. And they either agree or they agree in part and say there are certain components of this interview that we would rather not have out in the public domain right now. And if you go to the interview archive and you look at the interviews, you will find blacked out redactions in certain pages where somebody will say, all right, there are 3 paragraphs of this interview where I said some things that are really sensitive, either on a national security dimension or on points of personal privilege. Look, I call this person an SOB. I really don't want people to know I call them an SOB, so I'm going to black that out. And then they allow us to open the interview. Now, we could, as a matter of course, and some of my colleagues do, get a signed release of an interview in advance of the recording, so that I could, if I were to sit down with Doug, I would say, okay, I want you to sign this document now, allowing us to release everything you say. We know what happens under those circumstances. People edit themselves into the tape recorder. They start thinking about, all right, do I really want this part to come out? And rather than speaking it into the recorder, they will stop saying it. What we have found is that if we leave it unsettled at the beginning, people will often say, Russell, I'm going to tell you this, but I can tell you right now, I'm not going to let this out for 20 years. And you know what often happens? They'll look at the transcript, they'll get 3 or 4 months later, and they'll think, this is not really a big deal after all, and it'll come out. And if you look at our interviews, this happens over and over and over again. They will say, I'm not letting this out for, this part's going to be embargoed forever. And in fact, they decide the historical purposes are important enough for us to let you open them. Look, part of the reason they do that is because the Miller Center has a reputation for not abusing these privileges. I'm not out here trying to convince you to vote against Hillary Clinton or for Hillary Clinton. The Kirkus interview, or the Kirkus review of this book, I was so happy with. It was said, it crackles in every chapter with anecdotes. There are plenty of material in this book for Clinton detractors and Clinton supporters alike. I couldn't have written that better myself. That's the way it ought to be. And I've got people who will be critical of the book because the Clinton Foundation was supportive of our efforts by funding this in the same way that all of the library foundations fund our interviews. Are very expensive. We get contributions from them to make these things possible. So there were people who will say, but the Miller Center is bought off by the Clinton Foundation, and by the same token, a month ago, I opened up my internet browser and discovered that the Daily Mail, a tabloid in London, has my picture there with Hillary Clinton saying this man's book is going to sink Mrs. Clinton's chances to be president. because it's got all of this scandalous stuff in there about her husband and about all of the foul language that they were using and all of these personal things about the Clintons. This Riley guy is going to sink Mrs. Clinton. I was beside myself. My editor was thrilled. She said, "That's going to help you sell books."
It's a good thing. It's a good thing.
So the idea is that we don't abuse the privilege. We take the material and we try to be as scholarly as we can in our assessments of it. But it's still a good question. It strikes people as a little odd when they first hear it, but it's just a part of our routine course.
But also isn't a part of that, just to have said it, that the oral history folks also, it's important to talk to people when memories are still reasonably fresh. You can't do a 3-day interview with Dick Cheney on his deathbed. You can't wait until.
No. It's better to do it early. If you can. It's funny, John Sununu, who was the White House Chief of Staff under George H.W. Bush, said, you guys really ought to do 2 interviews. You ought to do one right after somebody leaves office because their memories are going to be fresh, but things are going to be so raw that they're going to edit and they won't want to tell you much. And you come back to them 10 years later and you get the reverse picture. They'll tell you everything, but their memories aren't very good. And it's sort of a combination platter. We try to come at people. We're in discussions with the Obama Foundation right now. We would love to get started on this as soon as possible. We talk about the actuarial imperative in this business. There are people who age and who are ill, and the worst thing in the world is to lose somebody before you've had the opportunity to talk with them, to record their recollections. So sooner is better. Sooner is better.
The mass incarceration issue is coming up again. Can you talk about how the 2 Clintons handled this? Because she's being accused of a lot of things that correlated with Bill Clinton.
Sure. The mass incarceration, I can't even say the word, incarceration issue arises as a result of the crime bill in 1994. There was almost no concern about this in 1994. It's something that has arisen since then. And in fact, there's very little within the interviews themselves because we are subject to the same tides of history that you are. And the notion of what in academia is called the carceral state is something that is a fairly recent provenance. It's become of scholarly attention only since about 2010 or 11. And most of these interviews were conducted before then. So there really wasn't even within the scholarly community a great deal of attention to this particular issue. The one thing that I can say is that there's a fascinating exchange with one of Clinton's congressional liaisons, and the name is escaping me again right now. I'm getting old myself, but in which he talks about the crime bill, not because of this, but because of the gun issue. I mean, that was the piece of it that really resonated at the time, because Clinton was pushing for this, and there was an assault weapon ban, and there are many Democrats on Capitol Hill who say it wasn't health care that sank the Democrats' chances in 1994. It was the assault weapon ban, because it activated the National Rifle Association, and you just had a huge tidal wave of Democrats losing southern districts because they were confronted with voting in favor of this weapons ban. So I actually wrote a piece. You could Google, not that you would want to, but in the Atlantic on the Atlantic Monthly website on Bill Clinton and the assault weapon ban, because he was just firmly committed to getting this done and had to really exercise the full authority of the president's powers in order to make this happen in a way that many Democrats were strongly opposed to. So yes, both he and Hillary were pressing for that bill, but I think that what happened with the mass incarceration sort of fits the law of unintended consequences. But it also is a fascinating component of how presidential legacies change. I mean, who knew? 10 years ago, nobody would have thought of this. Even 5 years ago, it was a little blip on the horizon. Now it becomes an important public policy issue, and people examine Bill Clinton's legacy based on something that even those of us as scholars spending thousands of hours of time with his people wouldn't have thought to ask about. Fascinating bit of evidence about how legacies change over time.
We should probably stop it right there. Thank you very much. That was terrific.
Thank you all.